My name is Madison, and I'm 34 years old. Today, I want to share a story with you about the day my family ignored my sorrow when I needed them most, and how that devastating moment eventually led me to create something profoundly meaningful. It's a difficult story, filled with pain and betrayal, but also one about finding strength in the deepest darkness and building a life independent of the validation I once craved from the people who should have offered it unconditionally. Before I dive in, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Let me know your city and country in the comments below. And if you've ever felt completely alone in your grief, ignored by the people who are supposed to love you, please hit the like button so I know I'm not alone either. Also, consider subscribing if you want to hear more stories like this about navigating complex family dynamics and finding your voice. Growing up, my family life was complicated. On the surface, we were the picture of suburban normalcy. Holidays were celebrated, birthdays acknowledged, and there was a general expectation of togetherness. But beneath that veneer, there was a constant undercurrent of unspoken tension and emotional disconnect. My parents, my mother especially, had a way of making everything about them, of invalidating feelings that didn't fit their narrative of a perfect family. My father was quieter, less overtly critical, but his silence often felt like tacit agreement with my mother's pronouncements. I learned early to keep my struggles to myself. If I was sad, I was told I was being dramatic. If I was angry, I was being disrespectful. Joy was acceptable, but only if it was expressed in a way that reflected well on them. It was a subtle form of emotional starvation, a slow erosion of my sense of self-worth, built on the foundation that my feelings were less important, less real, than theirs. This dynamic wasn't unique to me, but it felt particularly acute. My older brother, Michael, seemed to navigate it by conforming, becoming the son they wanted, successful, emotionally reserved, never rocking the boat. He wasn't cruel, but he was distant, a product of the same environment, perhaps, but one who had learned to survive by minimizing his own emotional landscape and, by extension, unable or unwilling to engage with mine. Despite this, I clung to the hope that when something truly significant happened, something genuinely devastating, the family bonds would prove stronger than the everyday dysfunction. I believed, deep down, that in a crisis, they would rally, that the inherent love I knew must be there, somewhere, would finally break through the layers of their own issues and reach me. I was naive. The day everything changed was a Tuesday. It was a day that started like any other, mundane and ordinary, until it wasn't. I received a phone call that shattered my world into a million irreparable pieces. The details of the event itself aren't as important to this story as its impact and my family's reaction, but suffice it to say, it was a loss. A profound, unexpected loss that ripped the ground from under me and plunged me into the kind of grief that felt like a physical assault. It was a loss that involved someone incredibly important to me, someone who had been a source of light and unconditional acceptance, a stark contrast to the conditional nature of my family's affection. My first instinct, after the initial wave of shock and pain, was to call my family. Who else do you turn to when your world falls apart? You turn to the people who are supposed to be your anchor, your safe harbor. I was shaking, tears streaming down my face, barely able to breathe. I called my mother first. "Hello," she answered, her voice bright, oblivious. "Mom." I choked out, the word ragged and broken. "Something terrible. Something awful has happened." I tried to explain, through sobs, the magnitude of the loss. I wasn't coherent, not perfectly, but I was clear enough. I conveyed the core message. I was in immense pain. Something devastating had occurred, and I needed her. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not a pause of shocked silence or immediate concern, but a hesitant, almost annoyed, pause. "Well, what happened?" she asked, her tone shifting, becoming less bright, more inconvenienced. I managed to articulate a little more, enough for her to grasp the basic facts of the situation. The person, the loss. And then she said it. The words that would echo in my mind for years, the words that solidified every fear I'd ever had about their capacity for empathy. "Oh," she said, and I braced myself for the expected maternal comfort, the rushed questions about whether I was okay, the offer to come to me, anything. But that's not what came. Well, that's very sad. I suppose. I was stunned into silence for a moment. Suppose? I whispered, the word barely audible. My heart, already broken by the news I'd received minutes earlier, splintered further. Yes, sad, she repeated, her voice regaining some of its earlier lightness, as if ticking a box. But, these things happen, Madison. Life has its ups and downs. You can't let yourself get too upset about it. I was drowning in grief, and she was telling me not to get too upset. It was like being told not to breathe while underwater.
Mom, I
don't think you understand. I stammered. This is huge.
I'm devastated.
I don't know what to do. Well, what is there to do? She replied, a note of impatience creeping in. You just
carry on.
That's what you do. People pass away. It's part of life. She then pivoted, seamlessly, to talking about her own day. A minor inconvenience at the grocery store, a funny story about the neighbor's dog. It was as if my world-ending news was a brief, unpleasant interruption to her perfectly ordinary afternoon. There was no offer of comfort, no expression of genuine sorrow for me, no question about how I was feeling beyond that initial, perfunctory what happened. I hung up the phone feeling colder and more alone than I had before I called. The grief was still there, a crushing weight, but now it was compounded by a burning ache of betrayal. I tried my father next. His reaction was less overtly dismissive, but perhaps even more painful in its passivity. When I told him, his response was a series of grunts and mumbled, "Oh, dears," there was no elaboration, no questions, no attempt at connection. It was as if he processed the information as a factual report, devoid of any emotional resonance. He quickly handed the phone back to my mother, saying he was busy with something in the garage. Busy. On the day I called, shattered by loss, he was busy. My brother, Michael, was the final call. I was hesitant, knowing his tendency towards emotional distance, but I felt desperate. Perhaps, I thought, facing a genuine tragedy would break through his reserve. It didn't. His response was polite, sterile. "Oh, Madison, I'm sorry to hear that. That's difficult." No offer of help, no suggestion of a visit, no real inquiry into my state. He offered generic condolences, the kind you'd give an acquaintance, not your sister. He mentioned he had a busy week at work and hoped I'd be okay. Be okay. The expectation was that I would just be okay, that I would absorb this seismic shock, this profound grief, entirely on my own. The days that followed were a blur of pain and disbelief. I navigated the immediate practicalities surrounding the loss in a daze, relying on friends, truly wonderful friends who showed up without hesitation, bringing food, offering hugs, just sitting with me in silence. My family remained distant. They sent a generic card, a small, utterly impersonal gesture that felt like an insult rather than comfort. There were no phone calls checking in, no follow-up questions, nothing that indicated they grasped the depth of my despair or the significance of the person I had lost. The silence from them was deafening. It screamed their priorities, their limitations, their fundamental inability to meet me in my time of deepest need. It wasn't just the absence of comfort. It was the active dismissal of my pain on the phone calls, the casual indifference that felt colder than outright hostility. I remember sitting alone in my apartment, surrounded by the quiet, the grief heavy in the air, and feeling a profound sense of abandonment. This wasn't just about this specific loss. It felt like the culmination of a lifetime of not being seen, not being heard, not being validated by the people who were supposed to be my foundation. The worst day wasn't just the day of the loss itself. It was also the day I fully grasped the terrifying truth about my family's emotional limitations and how they failed me at my most vulnerable. For a long time, I was stuck in a cycle of trying to understand them. Why couldn't they just be there for me? Was it something I did? Was I asking too much? I replayed the phone calls endlessly, searching for a sign, a hidden meaning, anything that would explain away the coldness. Therapy helped. My therapist patiently guided me through understanding that their reaction wasn't a reflection of my worthiness of comfort, but a reflection of their own emotional deficits. They couldn't give what they didn't have. They couldn't sit with my pain because they couldn't sit with their own. My mother's need to control the narrative, to present a strong, problem-free facade, meant she couldn't acknowledge devastating grief because it shattered that image. My father's passive avoidance was his lifelong coping mechanism. My brother's distance was his learned survival trait. Understanding it intellectually didn't magically heal the wound, though. The pain of their failure to support me intertwined with the pain of the loss itself. There were resources, of course, but finding immediate human connection felt challenging. Helplines existed, but many felt geared towards immediate crisis intervention rather than the sustained, complex, and often messy process of grieving. I remember one particularly dark night, months later, still struggling immensely. I felt overwhelmed, the world gray and meaningless. I thought about calling someone, but who? My friends had their own lives, their own struggles. Calling my family was unthinkable. The memory of their reaction was too raw. I wish there was someone, a stranger even, who was trained just to listen to someone talk about their grief, without judgment, without trying to fix it, just to be present in it. That thought stayed with me. The idea of a dedicated space, a voice on the other end of a phone line, specifically for people lost in the fog of grief, people who, like me, might feel they have no one else to turn to, or whose usual support systems were failing them. It seemed like such a simple concept, yet I couldn't find exactly what I was envisioning. As I slowly, painstakingly began to heal, to build a new life around the shape of my loss, that idea took root. My own experience had been a crucible. The failure of my family, while initially devastating, had forced me to look inward, to find my own strength, to build my own support system. It had also given me a clarity I hadn't possessed before. I no longer harbored illusions about my family dynamic. I saw it for what it was: limited, self-centered, and emotionally unsafe. This clarity was empowering, but it also meant facing difficult conversations. I couldn't pretend their reaction hadn't happened. I couldn't sweep it under the rug. The pain festered, and I knew for my own healing, I needed to address it, not for their sake, but for mine. Setting boundaries with my family was terrifying. They were accustomed to me being the adaptable one, the one who smoothed things over, who didn't make demands. The idea of asserting my needs, especially after their spectacular failure to meet them, felt like scaling a sheer cliff face. But I knew it was necessary for my survival, for my ability to move forward. My first attempt was subtle. I started limiting my phone calls with my mother. When she launched into monologues about her day without asking about mine, I would politely interject, "Mom, I actually wanted to talk about something that's been difficult for me." More often than not, she would deflect, change the subject, or offer a superficial platitude before returning to herself. It was like hitting a brick wall, but each time I tried, I felt a tiny spark of defiance, a reclaiming of my own space. The real test came during a family gathering, the first one of any significance since the loss. It was a birthday dinner for my father. I dreaded it. My stomach twisted in knots at the thought of facing them, of pretending everything was fine. But I felt an obligation to go. The evening was strained. They made polite inquiries about my job, my apartment, surface-level things. The person I had lost was not mentioned. My grief was invisible. It was like they had collectively decided to edit that entire painful chapter out of our family history. As dinner wound down, sitting around the table with the remnants of dessert, my mother made a casual comment about how resilient I was, how well I had bounced back after that sad business. The words were meant, I think, as a compliment, or perhaps a self-congratulatory note on her part, implying that her minimal, dismissive response was somehow effective in fostering my resilience. Something snapped inside me. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the frustration of the past year boiled to the surface. My voice trembled, but it was firm. "Mom," I said, cutting across her cheerful tone. Everyone at the table went quiet, sensing the shift. My brother looked down at his plate. My father shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't just sad business, it was the most devastating loss of my life. And honestly, my voice grew stronger, though a tear escaped and tracked down my cheek. Your reaction, your complete lack of support, made it so much harder. My mother's face hardened instantly. Her mask of pleasantness shattered, replaced by indignation. What are you talking about, Madison? We were supportive. Supportive, I echoed, a bitter laugh escaping me. Mom, I called you completely broken and you told me not to get too upset and then changed the subject. Dad handed the phone off because he was busy. Michael gave me a polite, "I'm sorry to hear that," and talked about his work week. That wasn't support. That was abandonment. Her voice rose, sharp and defensive. That's unfair. We didn't know what to say. It's uncomfortable. And we sent a card. What more were we supposed to do? You're supposed to be my mother, I said, my voice breaking again, but I pushed through. You were supposed to hold me, or at least offer to. You were supposed to ask how I was really doing, not just dismiss my pain. You were supposed to show me you cared that I was hurting, not just acknowledge that these things happen. My father finally spoke, his voice low and uncomfortable. Madison, that's not fair. Your mother was just trying to be strong for you. Strong? I scoffed. Dismissing someone's grief isn't strength, Dad. It's avoidance. It's fear. My brother, Michael, finally looked up. He didn't defend them, but he didn't validate me either. He just looked uncomfortable, trapped. I needed my family, I continued, directing my gaze at all of them. And you weren't there. And that pain, on top of everything else, was almost unbearable. I had to navigate the darkest time in my life feeling completely alone because the people who were supposed to be my anchor couldn't handle my sorrow. They ignored it. They pretended it wasn't happening. And that is something I won't forget. The silence that followed was thick with tension. My mother was visibly angry, her face flushed. My father looked pained, whether for me or for himself. I couldn't tell. Michael remained stoic, awkward. Well, my mother finally said, her voice dripping with coldness, if that's how you feel, maybe it's best if we just don't talk about difficult things then. Maybe it's best if we don't talk much at all. It was a threat, a punishment for speaking my truth. But this time, it didn't break me. This time, I didn't back down. Maybe that is best, I said quietly, standing up from the table. Because I won't pretend anymore. I won't pretend that day didn't happen, and I won't pretend your reaction was anything other than deeply hurtful and fundamentally unsupportive. I left the dinner shortly after. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, walking away from a table full of family, knowing I had just ignited a fire that couldn't be easily extinguished. But as I drove home, the tears were different this time. They were still tears of pain, but also tears of release, tears of vindication. I had finally said it. I had named their failure. I had validated my own experience, something they had refused to do. The fallout from that night was significant. My mother didn't speak to me for weeks, a classic tactic of hers to punish perceived defiance. My father occasionally sent a strained text message. My brother remained distant, seemingly relieved he hadn't been the primary target, but also offering no bridge. It was painful, of course. There were moments of doubt, wondering if I had overreacted, if I should have just kept quiet to maintain the semblance of peace, however fragile. But then I would remember the depth of my loneliness on that worst day, the casual cruelty of their dismissal, and I knew I had done the right thing for myself. I had chosen my own well-being over their comfort and their carefully constructed facade. As I continued my healing journey, working through the layers of grief and familial trauma, the idea of the grief hotline kept returning. It wasn't just an abstract concept anymore. It felt like a calling, a way to channel my pain into purpose. I didn't want anyone else to feel as abandoned and alone in their grief as I had. I wanted to create the resource I desperately needed and couldn't find. I started small, researching existing helplines, connecting with people in the mental health field, reading everything I could about grief and trauma support. It was a daunting task, requiring far more than just a good intention. There were legal hurdles, funding challenges, the complexities of training volunteers, setting up infrastructure. There were many moments where I felt overwhelmed, where the scale of the project seemed insurmountable. But the memory of that lonely, dark night, wishing for someone to listen, propelled me forward. I remembered the sting of my mother's words, the hollowness of my father's mumbles, my brother's polite distance. That pain became fuel. I was building something not despite their failure, but in a strange way, because of it. Their inability to see my pain gave me the clarity to see a need in the world, and the motivation to try and fill it. I started reaching out to local nonprofits, attending workshops on starting a nonprofit, learning about fundraising. I found allies, therapists, social workers, other people who had experienced profound grief and understood the isolation that often comes with it. They validated my idea, offered support, and shared their expertise. It was through these connections that I truly began to understand what genuine support looked like, not just saying the right words, but showing up, offering practical help, and believing in someone's vision. One of the most challenging parts was the fundraising. Convincing people to donate to an untested idea, a hotline specifically for grief, was difficult. Grief is uncomfortable. People often shy away from it. But I shared my story, raw and vulnerable, explaining why this was needed. I spoke about the silence, the isolation, the feeling of being a burden. I spoke about that specific moment of reaching out to my family and being met with indifference. That personal narrative resonated with people in ways that statistics couldn't. Many shared their own stories of feeling alone in grief, of wishing for someone to listen. Slowly, painstakingly, things began to fall into place. We secured initial funding, found a small office space, developed training materials for volunteers, focused on empathetic listening and non-judgmental support. We weren't therapists, we were listeners. People who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer someone in pain is simply your presence and a willingness to hear their story, no matter how difficult it is. The process of building the hotline was incredibly healing for me. It allowed me to reframe my trauma. Instead of just being a victim of my family's emotional neglect, I became an architect of something positive. Every step forward, every volunteer trained, every dollar raised felt like a quiet victory against the forces of indifference that had almost crushed me. During this time, my relationship with my family remained strained. After the birthday dinner confrontation, communication was minimal. Holidays were awkward, brief encounters where we tiptoed around any topic that might lead to genuine emotion. There were no apologies offered, no acknowledgement from them that they could have handled things differently. They seemed content to maintain the emotional distance I had inadvertently created by speaking my truth. It wasn't the reconciliation I once dreamed of, but it was a form of resolution, a clear, albeit painful, understanding of the limits of our connection. There was one moment, months after the confrontation, where my mother cautiously asked about the project I was working on. I told her about the hotline, about the goal of providing support for people in grief. She listened, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Perhaps pride, perhaps regret. It was hard to tell. But she quickly masked it with a non-committal, that sounds nice. No questions about how it was going, no offer of help, nothing that indicated genuine interest or understanding of the deep personal connection it had to my own experience. It was a stark reminder that while I had changed, they largely remained the same. My father occasionally asked Michael about it, and Michael would relay minimal information. It was clear they discussed my life amongst themselves, but direct, emotionally honest communication with me remained impossible for them. Launching the hotline was one of the proudest moments of my life. Taking the first call was terrifying and exhilarating. On the other end was someone lost and hurting, their voice trembling with tears, sharing their story of loss and isolation. I listened. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't tell them these things happen. I just listened, validated their pain, and let them know they weren't alone in feeling that way. It was a simple act, but in that moment, it felt like the most important work in the world. It was the conversation I wished I could have had, finally happening, but for someone else. Since then, the hotline has grown. We've trained more volunteers, expanded our hours, reached more people. Each call, each message of thanks we receive, reinforces the importance of this work and validates the difficult path I had to walk to get here. My relationship with my family is still not what I would call close. The confrontation created a permanent shift. There's a polite distance now, an acknowledgement that certain topics are off-limits. We see each other occasionally for holidays, but the interactions are carefully curated, emotionally sterile. There was never a sit-down, tearful reconciliation, no grand apologies. I've had to accept that they may never fully understand the depth of how their actions affected me, or they may understand but are simply incapable of acknowledging it in a meaningful way. And that's okay. My healing is no longer dependent on their validation. I learned that sometimes, the people who are supposed to be your closest allies can be the ones who hurt you the most, not necessarily out of malice, but out of their own woundedness and limitations. I learned that grief is a journey that requires support, and when that support doesn't come from the expected places, you have to find it elsewhere or build it yourself. The worst day was devastating, yes, but it was also a catalyst. It exposed the truth of my family dynamic and forced me to confront it. It pushed me to find my own strength, to set boundaries, and ultimately, to create something positive out of profound pain. I still feel moments of sadness about the distance between me and my family, especially during times when families are supposed to come together. There's a lingering ache for the unconditional love and support I craved and didn't receive. But it's no longer a gaping wound. It's a scar, a reminder of where I've been and how far I've come. Founding the Grief Hotline gave me a sense of purpose that transcends the pain. It allows me to connect with others on a level of deep empathy, to offer the listening ear and the validation that was denied to me. It is proof that even from the most hurtful experiences, something meaningful can emerge. My journey taught me that your truth is valid, even if the people closest to you refuse to see or hear it. It taught me the power of setting boundaries, even when it's incredibly difficult and comes with uncomfortable consequences. Most importantly, it taught me that I am capable of not just surviving betrayal and sorrow, but of using those experiences to help light the way for others. So, that's my story. It's a story about loss, about familial failure, about confrontation, and ultimately, about finding purpose in the aftermath of pain. Thank you for listening. If anything in my story resonated with you, especially the feeling of being alone in your pain or having your feelings dismissed by family, please let me know in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who couldn't or wouldn't validate your feelings? How did you navigate that? If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. It helps others who might need to hear this find the video. And please subscribe for more stories about navigating toxic relationships, finding your voice, and building a life filled with authenticity and purpose. Don't forget to subscribe. Remember, your feelings are valid, your pain deserves to be seen, and you are stronger than you think. You are not alone.